I never imagined my fairy tale would end like this. The sound of clinking champagne glasses echoed through the grand mansion, a symphony of wealth and elegance. The Sullivan family was hosting another one of their extravagant gatherings, and I was standing at the corner of their sprawling garden, observing the perfect family from the sidelines. But as I looked around, something inside me began to stir, an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't shake. I had married Andrew Sullivan thinking I had found my happily ever after. He was everything I could have ever dreamed of: handsome, ambitious, and charming. And his family, they were just as perfect as I had imagined. They were the epitome of old money, classy, polished, and established. I had married into a world where every meal was gourmet, every house was a mansion, and every moment seemed curated for perfection. But I was wrong. That afternoon, as I stood in the midst of the glitz and glam, a part of me knew something wasn't right. I had been married to Andrew for 3 years, and in those 3 years I had watched him grow distant, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I had always dismissed my discomfort as paranoia. After all, his family had welcomed me, hadn't they? But there were moments, subtle and unsettling, that couldn't be ignored. The deep voice of Andrew's father, Harold, reached my ears as he discussed some business deal with a guest from the Bradley family. Margaret, his mother, stood tall next to him, her perfectly styled hair glinting in the sunlight. She looked over at me with a thin smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Deanne," she said, her voice sweet but laced with condescension, "you're handling everything perfectly today. You've always been so efficient." I stiffened, forcing a smile. It was always like this. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to fit into this world, I was never quite enough. I was never quite a Sullivan. Margaret's words clung to me like a weight I could never shed. But as I looked around, my gaze flicked to Andrew, who was in the middle of a conversation with his sister, Meredith. He caught my eye for just a second, before turning back to her, his smile never faltering. I felt it then, that invisible divide between us. I wasn't just the wife anymore. I wasn't even family. I was an outsider in my own marriage. The whispers from the other wives were faint but noticeable. "Did you hear about the latest charity gala? I can't believe they invited her to the event. The cafe girl," I overheard one of them say. The sting of those words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. The truth was, I didn't belong here. But then, as the sun began to set and the party reached its peak, Andrew approached me with his signature warmth. His brown eyes met mine with a gentle, reassuring look that made me feel like everything was going to be okay. "You're amazing, you know that," he whispered, his hand brushing against mine. "I'm proud of you." For a moment, I felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was okay. But as the night wore on, the cracks in our marriage, in this family, and in my own self-worth, grew too loud to ignore. The perfect image I had once believed in began to fade, revealing the ugly truths I had kept buried for so long. It was later that night, at the engagement party for Meredith, that everything came to a head. The engagement party was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but for me, it felt like a ticking time bomb. Andrew's family was at their finest, elegant, flawless, and meticulously curated. But as the hours passed, I began to feel more and more like a shadow in their perfect world. Every polite smile from Margaret, every dismissive comment from Harold, every cold glance from Meredith, it all weighed on me. It wasn't always like this. When Andrew and I first met, he was so different from his family. He was grounded, humble, and genuinely kind. But as soon as I was swept into his world, I realized how much of his humility was a carefully crafted facade. He had grown up with everything handed to him: money, connections, privilege. And as much as he seemed to want to make his own way, deep down, he was still bound by his family's expectations. The first cracks had appeared shortly after we got engaged. I thought I could handle the pressure. I thought I could fit in with the Sullivan family. After all, I had managed my own cafe, worked my way up from nothing, and I was proud of what I had accomplished. But with every gathering, every event, it became clearer to me that I would never be enough for them. I tried, oh how I tried. When we first moved into the house Andrew's family bought for us, I was thrilled. It was a beautiful, sprawling mansion in the exclusive Hillrest neighborhood. But the excitement quickly faded as I found myself increasingly isolated. Andrew worked long hours at the family's investment firm, leaving me in a neighborhood where I knew no one and had nothing in common with the other wives. I attended charity galas and luncheons with the other women, desperately trying to fit in, but Margaret always made sure to remind me that I didn't belong. Deanne, dear, she would say with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, you should really join the ladies' auxiliary. It's a great honor. It's the least you can do for your family's image. The ladies' auxiliary was a joke, a group of wealthy women who spent their days planning charity events and gossiping about who wore what and who was invited to which exclusive gathering. I had tried to contribute, using my experience in event management, but Margaret would always smile thinly and say, let's stick to tradition, darling. You'll understand eventually. But I was already beginning to understand, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. I had grown up in Meadowbrook, a small town where hard work meant something. My parents owned a small hardware store that barely kept us afloat, but they taught me the value of earning my place. By the time I was 16, I was waiting tables at a diner to help out, balancing school and work. After high school, I worked full-time while taking night classes at community college. I was proud of where I had gotten on my own. I didn't need anyone's charity, least of all from a family that viewed me as an accessory to their social standing. But Andrew didn't see it that way. He had fallen in love with my ambition, my drive. He told me it was one of the things that made him love me. You're not like the others, he would say, but I soon realized he meant that in the worst possible way. He wanted someone who would stay quiet, who would fall in line with his family's expectations, who wouldn't challenge the status quo. The more I tried to break free, the more I realized how trapped I was. One of the most crushing moments came at our wedding. It was small, hurriedly planned, supposedly because Andrew's grandmother was ill, though she appeared perfectly healthy at the ceremony. The Sullivan family barely contributed, and when Margaret did step in, it was to ensure everything was exactly to her liking. Better to keep things simple given the circumstances, she had said. Simple, the word stung. My wedding wasn't about me, it was about keeping up appearances. I had hoped that things would get better once we settled into our life together, but they didn't. I gave up managing the cafe to support Andrew's career, convinced it was only temporary. You can pursue your dreams later, he had promised me, but it never happened. As Andrew worked longer hours at the family business, I found myself increasingly alone in our mansion, isolated from everything and everyone I knew. The tipping point came when I overheard a conversation between Andrew's mother and sister. They were sitting in our house, discussing wedding plans for Meredith, Andrew's sister, who had recently gotten engaged to a man from a wealthy shipping family. I didn't think much of it until I overheard Margaret dismissing my contributions with a laugh. Why would we need Deanne's help? She had sneered. She doesn't understand how to plan an event in our circles, she's just the cafe girl. Her words hit harder than I ever could have anticipated. I had never felt more like an outsider than in that moment. That was when I started to question everything. Was this who I was now, the wife of a man whose family didn't even see me as worthy of sitting at the same table? But the real breaking point came at Meredith's engagement party. The engagement party was the night I realized I could no longer keep pretending. Everything about the night was perfect. The grand estate, the perfectly curated guest list, the laughter that seemed to echo from the walls, and the champagne that flowed like water. It all looked like a scene from a movie, and for the first time in years, I wondered if I was merely playing a part in someone else's production. Andrew had been distracted all evening. Every time I tried to catch his eye, he was deep in conversation with his family or one of the other guests. I had become so used to being ignored that it no longer hurt. But tonight, I couldn't ignore the weight of my own silence. Margaret had orchestrated the entire party. She chose the caterers, the floral arrangements, the music, the guest list, everything was in her control. And once again, I felt like I was just the observer, standing in the background of my own life. As the evening wore on, the discomfort in my chest grew. I had never felt so isolated, even with Andrew by my side. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves. Meredith's engagement party was a big deal, after all, but deep down, I knew it was something more. This wasn't just about an event. This was about my place in this family, or more accurately, my lack of one. I had spent the entire evening trying to fit in. I'd been to every event, every gathering, and yet every time, it felt like I was on the outside looking in. I'd always known that I wasn't truly a part of Andrew's world, but the mask I'd worn for years was beginning to slip. But tonight was different. As I moved through the crowd, I caught the eye of one of the other wives, Margaret's closest friend, a woman named Carol. She offered me a polite smile, but I could see the pity in her eyes. It wasn't the first time I'd seen that look. I'd gotten it many times from people in this circle, the wealthy, the powerful, the elite. The ones who didn't understand the world I came from and who didn't care to. But what stung more than anything was the coldness from Andrew. I hadn't seen him all night, and when I finally found him, he was laughing with Meredith and Jackson's parents, talking business and future plans. "Andrew," I said softly, touching his arm, "we need to talk." He turned to me, his expression momentarily faltering as if surprised by my presence. "What's up?" he asked casually, but I could tell he was already losing interest. "I've been trying, Andrew," I said, my voice wavering despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I've been trying to fit in, to be a part of this family, to be what you want. But I can't do this anymore. I don't belong here." His brow furrowed, his eyes flickering with annoyance. "Don't be dramatic," he said, his voice dismissive. "This is just how things are. You knew this when we got married." "No, I didn't," I shot back, the anger and frustration I'd been holding in for so long rising to the surface. "I didn't know I was marrying into a family that would treat me like nothing more than a project, a charity case to make you look good." His face hardened at my words, and for a split second I saw a flash of something, guilt, maybe, or regret. But it was quickly gone, replaced by his usual indifference. "You're overreacting, Deanne," he said coldly, turning back to the conversation with Meredith. "You're making this all about you." That was it, the last straw. I had spent the past 3 years making excuses for him, for his family, for everything that had slowly chipped away at me. I had buried my anger, my hurt, my frustration, telling myself it would get better. But standing there, surrounded by a sea of unfamiliar faces, with Andrew turning his back on me, I realized that nothing would change. He didn't care. None of them did. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't let myself cry. No, I couldn't. I wasn't going to cry over this. I wasn't going to let them see how much they had hurt me. And then Margaret appeared beside me, her eyes flashing with icy determination. "Deanne, darling," she said in her sweet, condescending voice, "perhaps you should go back to the kitchen and check on the staff. We don't want any mistakes tonight." The words hit me like a slap. It wasn't just a comment about my place in this house, it was a direct insult. A reminder that, no matter how much I had tried to fit in, no matter how hard I worked, I would always be the help in their eyes. I looked down at the name tag Margaret had pinned to my dress earlier in the evening, Housekeeper, and I felt the heat of humiliation burn through me. Something inside me snapped. I had been pushing myself, bending over backward to prove my worth, to fit into a world that would never accept me. But now, as I stood there, I realized that it wasn't worth it anymore. I wasn't going to be anyone's servant, not even in the guise of a wife. I took a deep breath, letting the rage and hurt surge through me. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady but filled with finality. "I'm done." Andrew looked at me, his face unreadable. "What are you talking about?" he asked, confused but unbothered. "I'm leaving," I said firmly. "I'm walking out of this place, out of this life. I deserve better than this." His eyes widened in shock, but it didn't matter. He was too late. I turned away from him, from his family, from everything I had tried to be a part of, and I walked out of the garden, through the house, past the smiling guests, and out the door. I had no idea what would come next, but for the first time in years, I felt free. The cool night air hit me like a wave as I stepped outside the Sullivan mansion, my heels clicking sharply on the stone path. I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses behind me, but I didn't look back. I refused to. The finality of my decision settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating yet liberating at the same time. I kept walking. I didn't know where I was going, but I wasn't stopping. My hands trembled slightly as I fumbled for my phone in my clutch. It was only then that I realized Andrew hadn't even followed me. He hadn't come after me when I'd walked out. The one person who was supposed to care, who was supposed to stand by me, had let me walk away without so much as a word. I called a cab, not bothering to ask for a ride from Andrew. What was the point? He had made it clear how little I mattered. As I stood waiting for the cab to arrive, I could feel the tears threatening to spill, but I held them back. This was my choice. I was choosing to walk away, to not let the Sullivans have any more power over me. I couldn't allow them to reduce me to nothing more than a tool for their image anymore. The cab arrived, and I slid into the backseat, giving the driver the address of a small hotel on the outskirts of town. My mind raced as I stared blankly out the window, the passing streetlights casting fleeting shadows on my face. What now? Where would I go? What was I supposed to do? I had nothing. All the money was in Andrew's name. All the possessions in the house were his, gifts from his family. I didn't even know if I could get my things without him or his parents' approval. I was completely dependent on him and his family. The harsh reality of it hit me, and for a moment I felt a wave of panic. What had I done? Was I making a huge mistake? Had I overreacted? The thoughts spiraled as I fought to catch my breath, my chest tight with anxiety. The hotel was small, nothing like the mansion I'd just left behind. But it was mine for now, and that small sense of ownership was comforting. The room was simple but clean. A single bed, a desk, and a small bathroom. I set my clutch on the bed and sat down with a sigh, my body finally collapsing in exhaustion. I was alone. I hadn't been truly alone in years, not since I had met Andrew. I'd spent so long trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect Sullivan. But in the end, I had nothing. Nothing but the walls of this tiny room and the overwhelming weight of what I had just walked away from. The phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my spiraling thoughts. It was a message from Andrew. I need you to come home. This is childish. We can talk about this. I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the screen. My heart raced with conflicting emotions. I wanted to reply. I wanted to tell him everything I had been holding in for so long. I wanted to scream at him, to make him understand just how much he had hurt me, just how much his family had diminished me, reduced me to nothing more than a housekeeper. But I couldn't, not anymore. I put the phone down, my hand trembling as I fought to keep my composure. This was it. There was no going back now. Suddenly, the sound of a knock on the door startled me. I froze. Who could it be? I cautiously stood up, walking toward the door. Through the peephole, I could see the silhouette of a woman. I opened the door slowly, not sure what to expect. It was Sophia, the head of the catering team from the Sullivan party. She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and respect, her eyes soft as she held up a small bag. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said quietly, her voice gentle, "but I wanted to make sure you're okay. I saw what happened at the party, and I just wanted to bring you something." I glanced down at the bag in her hands. It was a simple brown paper bag, but something about it made my heart race. Could this be some kind of pity gesture from the Sullivan family? A final attempt to try to control me, to make me feel like I owed them something? Sophia must have sensed my hesitation because she added quickly, "It's just some clothes. I figured you might need them." I opened the bag and found a change of clothes, jeans, a sweater, and some toiletries. I didn't say anything at first, just stared at the items. And then I felt it, the smallest flicker of warmth in my chest. This woman, a stranger in many ways, had shown me more kindness than anyone in the Sullivan family ever had. Sophia gave me a small, understanding smile as she placed the bag down on the table beside me. "I know this is hard," she said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "But you're stronger than you know. You deserve better than what they've put you through. You deserve to be seen for who you are, not just what they want you to be." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't want to cry, but I couldn't help it. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt seen. Truly seen. "I don't know what to do now," I admitted quietly, my voice trembling. "I've lost everything. I'm not sure I can make it on my own." Sophia reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip firm yet comforting. "You've already made it this far," she said softly. "You've got the strength inside you. You're just starting to see it now." The tears that had been threatening to spill finally broke free, and I let them fall. I didn't fight them. I let myself feel everything I had been holding back for so long, the hurt, the anger, the fear, but also a small seed of relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own life. And I wasn't going to let anyone, not even Andrew, take that away from me. The following morning, I woke up to the unsettling realization that I had spent the night in a room that wasn't mine, wearing clothes that didn't belong to me, and living a life that didn't feel like mine either. But I had to face reality. I couldn't stay in the safety of my hotel room forever. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone in my hands, the bright screen flashing with missed calls from Andrew, text messages begging me to come home, and a single voicemail that left a sinking feeling in my stomach. It was from his mother, Margaret. Deanne, her voice was smooth and sickly sweet. This childish stunt has gone on long enough. I expect you to return home immediately. Andrew needs you. The Bradleys will be disappointed in you if you don't. We don't want to cause a scene, do we? Her words were a twisted blend of threat and manipulation, and they made my stomach churn. I could hear the condescending undertone in every syllable, feel the weight of her expectations pushing down on me from miles away. But I couldn't go back. Not like this. Not when I had already crossed the line, when I had already taken my first step into freedom, even if it felt terrifying. I took a deep breath and made a decision. I needed to leave town. I needed to find a new life, one where I didn't have to pretend, one where I could just be. But before I could go anywhere, I needed to make sure I was okay. I hadn't been feeling well for a few days, dizzy spells, nausea, and an overwhelming sense of exhaustion that never seemed to go away. A part of me had hoped it was just stress, but I couldn't ignore the symptoms any longer. I needed answers. I called a local clinic, and after a short wait, I was scheduled for a checkup. The doctor, a kind woman in her 40s, led me into an exam room and quickly got to work. The moment I mentioned the dizziness and fatigue, she suggested running a few tests. A blood test, some basic scans, nothing invasive, just the usual routine when someone feels rundown. She asked me a few more questions about my health history, and before I knew it, I was being sent to get an X-ray to rule out any underlying causes. I sat on the cold metal chair, the sterile smell of the hospital surrounding me, and tried to calm myself. I had spent so many years being treated as though I didn't matter, like I was nothing more than a footnote in my own story. For the first time in a long time, I was doing something for myself. I was taking control, even in a small way. The X-ray took only a few minutes. As I dressed and gathered my things, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. Despite everything, I knew that whatever came next, I would be okay. The doctor called me back into her office shortly after. Her face was kind, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "I've reviewed your results," she began. "And while everything seems normal at first glance, I do want to talk about your fatigue and dizziness. It could be caused by a number of things, but I'd like to take a closer look with some additional tests. I think it's important we check your hormone levels and possibly your thyroid function." I nodded, trying to hide my apprehension. My heart raced, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Just a few tests, it's nothing." As the doctor continued speaking, explaining the need for further monitoring, I found my thoughts drifting. I couldn't help but think of how everything in my life had suddenly become a series of unanswered questions. How had I gotten here? How had I gone from a confident, ambitious woman running a successful cafe to a shell of myself, beaten down and gasping for air in the world I had married into? But in that moment, sitting in a sterile office, hearing the doctor explain the next steps, something inside me clicked. I was still fighting. I had been fighting for so long, for so many reasons, and I couldn't stop now. No more hiding, no more pretending to be what others wanted me to be, no more putting my needs last. I knew I couldn't go back to the Sullivan family, but I also knew I couldn't go back to being the woman I had been before I walked out of that mansion. The tests were scheduled, and the doctor promised to call me with results in the next few days. I left the clinic with a sense of relief I hadn't expected. I walked back to my hotel, taking slow, steady steps. The bright sun was beginning to dip behind the buildings, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. As I walked, my thoughts kept drifting back to the night before, to the moment I had walked out of the Sullivan mansion, leaving behind everything I had once thought I needed. But now, with a clear head and the taste of freedom on my tongue, I realized that I had made the right choice. I would never go back. not to Andrew, not to his family. I had learned too much about myself to ever allow them to break me again. As I arrived at the hotel, I stopped in front of the doors, my heart heavy but hopeful. The road ahead would be long. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the weight of everything would threaten to pull me under. But I had survived the worst. I had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and now it was time for me to rebuild. I could no longer rely on the Sullivan family's approval or love. It was time to stand on my own 2 feet. It was time to be the woman I had always meant to be. And I wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop me. It's been a few months since I walked away from the Sullivan mansion, and while the road has been rocky, I can honestly say it's been the most liberating period of my life. I sit at my desk in my new office at the Grand Meridian Hotel, overlooking the city skyline as I sip my coffee. The sunlight filters through the blinds, casting long, gentle shadows over the room. It's a quiet, peaceful morning, and for the first time in a long while, I feel calm. But I didn't get here without a fight. When I first left Andrew, I was full of anger, fear, and doubt. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how to rebuild a life I had sacrificed so much of myself for. I had no job, no support system, just the clothes on my back and a small hotel room to call home. But I was determined. I found the strength I didn't know I had. And as I began to settle into my new job at the Grand Meridian, something shifted inside me. But it wasn't just about work. A few weeks into my new life, I found myself sitting in a therapy office, staring at a woman I barely knew, but who I knew could help me heal. The therapist, Dr. Myers, was patient, kind, and perceptive in a way I hadn't expected. Our first session was awkward but necessary. I hadn't realized how much I had buried until I started to talk about it. I told her about Andrew, about the way he had dismissed my feelings, about how I had tried for years to fit into a world that never accepted me, about how I had lost myself in his family's expectations. And I cried. I cried for the woman I used to be, the woman who had been forced to shrink herself in order to fit into a mold that was never meant for her. I cried for the years I had spent trying to prove myself to people who would never see me as I truly was. Dr. Myers listened patiently, never interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me with gentle eyes. "Deanne," she said softly, "you've been carrying a heavy burden for a long time, but you're not the woman you were when you walked into that mansion. You're not the woman who stood by, hoping someone would see her. You're the woman who walked away. You're the woman who chose herself. And that takes more courage than most people ever have." Her words, simple as they were, hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I had never seen myself that way, strong, capable, brave. But in that moment, I began to understand that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I was reclaiming my power, piece by piece, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me again. The therapy sessions became a regular part of my routine, helping me to process the years of manipulation, isolation, and self-doubt. But there were still moments of weakness. Moments when I wanted to call Andrew, when I wondered if I had made the wrong choice, when I questioned whether I had been too harsh. But every time, I reminded myself that I was no longer that woman. I was no longer the woman who would bend to the will of a family that never valued me. I was the woman who chose to stand up, to be seen, and to find my own way. One day, a few months after starting my new job, I received a letter. It was from Andrew. I hadn't heard from him since I left, and I wasn't sure I was ready to open this letter. But something in me told me I needed to. The letter was short, but the words hit me harder than I expected. "Deanne," it began, "I know I've failed you. I know I've been blind to the pain I caused you, and I'm sorry for that. I never meant to hurt you. But I realize now that I took you for granted. You deserve so much more than I gave you. I'll always care about you, but I understand if you never want to speak to me again. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I folded the letter carefully and placed it on my desk. The apology was too little, too late. It didn't erase the years of neglect, the years of feeling like I didn't matter. But in some strange way, it was what I needed to hear. I realized that, no matter how much I wanted closure from Andrew, I didn't need his apology to move on. I didn't need his approval to find happiness. I had already found that on my own. The decision to leave him, to leave the Sullivan family, was the hardest decision I had ever made, but it was also the best one. It had opened the door to a new life, one where I was free to pursue my passions, to be my authentic self, to surround myself with people who truly saw me. And in the quiet moments of reflection, when the weight of it all would try to creep back in, I would remind myself, I am not the sum of what they think of me. I am the sum of what I've chosen to become. I smiled softly as I looked out the window at the city skyline. It had been a long road, but I had found my strength. I had found my voice. And no one could take that away from me.